Okay, and so now we are to the point of discussing the core principles of the US Constitution. And so in this section, what we want to think about are both the underlying ideas behind why the framers set up particular aspects of the Constitution, and then understanding some of the details about those aspects of the Constitution. Whenever one teaches the Constitution or learns about the US Constitution, there are certain things that um, you'll have to know and will learn the ideas of how to amend the US Constitution, the system of separation of powers and checks and balances, the ideas of federalism. All of those things are part of any standard discussion of the Constitution. And so rather than just memorizing those things, which can be helpful, what I want to do is to link those main provisions to core ideas of what the framers had. And so that's what the emphasis is going to be on this set. One way of thinking about that is to think about how the framers of the US Constitution actually thought about people themselves. And we know about this because they wrote about it in the Federalist Papers. And we talked about the Federalist Papers when we talked a little bit about the historical background of the US Constitution. And they laid out this idea. The framers of the US Constitution, James Madison articulating this, is that they really didn't trust people. They thought that human nature was one of individuals being selfish, of people being able to just try to get whatever they want instead of having noble goals in mind. And so they were thinking about how do you set up a system of government when you know that people aren't going to act in the best way for the nation to go forward. And so they said, we can't change human nature. Instead, what we need to do is take human nature as it is and then try to work with that. And so they came up with a system. And to be fair to them, they didn't trust any individuals. They didn't trust we the people, and we're going to see more specifically that we the people were the people of Shays' Rebellion. They were drunk farmers with pitchforks, and so those individuals really can't be trusted because they're easily swayed by a charismatic leader. They are lazy, don't want to pay their taxes, and things like that. But at the same time, the framers also didn't trust the government officials. They thought that the government would use and abuse their power pretty easily. And so they wanted to make sure that they set up a system of government that would control both types of human beings, the government officials, so they couldn't abuse their powers, and at the same time, we the people. Um, and so, what we're going to also see is that they argue is that the Constitution created a number of different provisions that did both things simultaneously. So, as we're going to be talking about specifically, the system of separation of powers and checks and balances, for example, is a way to control the authority of government officials to make sure no one government official or no one branch of government had too much authority. But we're also going to talk about the ways in which that also served the purpose of making it hard for we the people to destroy this beautiful system that the framers came up with. Similarly, the difficulty of amending the US Constitution is one to show that it can protect against government abuse, but it is also a way that if we, the people, decide that something needs to be changed, for example, we would like to have more senators for larger states. So California would have more representation in the US Senate, or if we wanted to argue to get rid of the Electoral College, or if we thought about maybe members of the judicial branch, that we could be able to do that. But we can only do that if we change the Constitution. And so the difficulty of amending the Constitution makes it hard for we the people to have an influence. And so some argue because it's such an intricately created system, it makes it hard and we really shouldn't be playing around with it. So it's actually a good thing that we can't amend the US Constitution. Okay, so let's go on and talk specifically about the first part of this, which is if you don't trust government officials, what are you supposed to do? Because government officials were going to be given authority in the system of government, particularly because, as we remember, in the Constitutional Convention, there was a concern that the Articles of Confederation, the system of government that existed at that time, didn't have enough authority to do the things that it needed to do. You were going to be increasing the power of the national government at the expense of state government power, but you're going to increase the power of this national government, and so then government officials have real power to restrict the liberties of individuals, to take more powers away from state governments, to do decisions that won't actually help the country. And so it's a difficult thing to do. You're increasing the power, but it becomes a possibility of abuse of power. And so there's a famous quotation from Federalist Number 51 that lays out this difficult challenge that the framers felt they had when You wanted to have a system of government that had larger authority for the national government when you didn't trust them. And so they argue, James Madison, who wrote Federalist Number 51, said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, sick, then lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. And so the argument is that if we had angels, they're nice to each other, and we can just rely on the nature of angels to make sure they wouldn't do terrible things. But so, for example, if you are trying to sleep and you're an angel and the person next to you on the cloud next to you is playing the harp really loud at night and you can't sleep, you could just talk to the angel and say, hey, that was kind of loud, could you do that? And they would actually listen and apologize for it. Whereas with human beings, when you go to your neighbor talking about that their harp playing was too loud, you might get a very different response, especially if they own guns or other things like that. So this is one that indicates the idea of human nature, but they also said, and that last part of it is, you must enable the government to control the governed. You need to give power to the government. The government must be able to put down things like Shays' Rebellion. And so that's a discussion of an 18th century problem that these to solve. And then in the next step, you had to, even though you increase the power of this government to do real things, you have to oblige it to control itself. You have to set it up. Government officials, when doing their job, will actually be controlling themselves along the way. But you can't trust them. It isn't based on trust. Instead, you create institutions to allow that system of control. And so you need to give the government enough power to rule, which solves the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, but make sure that power is not a particular branch or a single government official. And so what they argue is one of the main provisions, one of the main ways in which you can do this is to have a republic. And so one thing that they had kept from the Articles of Confederation, moving to the US Constitution, was saying we're going to have a republic. We're not going to have a democracy. We're not going to have a monarchy. We're going to have a republic. A republic is one in which there is representative democracy. And so they said that's the first instance to recognize that we have some way of controlling these government officials because they need to run for re-election from time to time. And so as we talk about, let's be a little bit specific, we've mentioned it before, but in the House of Representatives, they're in office for 2 years. The US Senate, they're in office for 6 years. The presidency, the President of the United States, is in for 4 years. And after their term, they then face the voters. And the voters are asked a question, do you want this person to continue or would you like someone else to have the job? And so it is representative democracy, the system of electing officials and having those officials being re-elected, that allows there to be control over the government officials and the actions that they take. But they also point out that there needs to be much more. That's not enough. That's certainly important. It's certainly important, a step away from what we had under British rule, where it was too linked to the idea of the monarchy and to divine right of kings. You couldn't have a democracy, a direct democracy, because concerned about individuals having too much control over decisions because we, the people, didn't have the level of education, we didn't have the resources available to get that information. We were selfish. We wouldn't pay attention to anything but maybe some charismatic leader who will tell us not to pay our taxes and then give us justifications for why we should be morally superior when we're not doing what we should be doing in terms of paying our taxes. If we pay our taxes, then Massachusetts will be able to pay off some of its loans to France and Spain. Massachusetts can then trade with those places. And drunk farmers with pitchforks in western Massachusetts just didn't see that and didn't recognize that. And so instead, they held some judges hostage and set fire to courthouses, as we saw with Shays' Rebellion. And so this system was one that said, look, the very first instance, we're going to have a republic, that will help more. And so now we're going to move on to talk about what those provisions are and why they are ones that control government officials when they're doing their jobs from not abusing the power that they have.